The North Atlantic in the winter of 1942 was not a battlefield, it was a graveyard. It was a vast, freezing expanse of gray water, where the lifeline of the free world was being methodically strangled. Great Britain, standing alone against the Nazi behemoth, was starving. They needed steel from America, oil from Venezuela, and food from Canada just to survive another week. But between the ports of the New World and the docks of Liverpool lay the Black Pit, the area of the mid-Atlantic beyond the reach of Allied air cover. This was the hunting ground of the wolf packs. The German U-boat arm, commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz, was perhaps the most sophisticated killing machine on the planet. They were sleek, deadly predators that hunted in coordinated groups, guided by radio signals that cut through the ether, directing them to the bloated, slow-moving convoy fleets. The Germans were winning the tonnage war. They were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. And the secret to their success wasn't just torpedoes or sonar, it was information. In the subterranean bunkers of Berlin and in the radio rooms of the U-boat pens in occupied France, the Third Reich employed an army of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts. They believed they had achieved information dominance. Their own communications were secured by the Enigma machine, a device they considered unbreakable. Simultaneously, they were cracking Allied merchant codes with frightening regularity. Every time a convoy commodore radioed a course change to avoid a suspected U-boat concentration, German listening posts intercepted the signal. Within hours, the Wolfpack was rerouted to intercept the head of a specific section of German naval intelligence, a man steeped in the racial pseudoscience of the Nazi regime, whom we shall call Dr. Albright looked at the world through a prism of technological arrogance. To Albright and his colleagues, warfare was a mathematical equation. Superior engineering plus superior encryption equaled victory. They viewed the Allied reliance on outdated book ciphers and slow mechanical encryption as a symptom of decadent, inferior societies. Before the war, German anthropologists had visited North America. They had studied indigenous tribes, taking notes on their languages and cultures. They reported back to Berlin that these were dying cultures, speaking primitive dialects incapable of expressing the complex concepts of modern mechanized warfare. Albright had read these reports. He dismissed the idea that these languages could ever pose a threat to the Reich. How could a language that had no word for carburetor or high-frequency direction finding possibly compete with the precision of the German language, encased in the mathematical armor of the Enigma? The idea was laughable, but while Albright was comforting himself with the superiority of his machines, a desperate plan was being hatched in the offices of the Canadian military. The Allies knew their codes were insecure. They knew mechanical enciphering took too long, sometimes hours, to code, transmit, and decode a single critical message. In a tactical situation where a convoy was under attack or a bombing raid was being coordinated, that delay cost lives. They needed something instant. They needed something unbreakable. They needed a ghost in the machine. The answer lay in the vast plains of Saskatchewan and Alberta, in communities that the Canadian government had spent decades trying to silence. For generations, the Cree people, like many Indigenous nations across North America, had been subjected to a brutal system of forced assimilation. Their children were taken from their homes and placed in residential schools. In these places, the guiding philosophy was to kill the Indian and the child. They were punished, often severely, for speaking their own language. They were told their words were backward, heathen, and useless in the modern world. It was a profound and bitter irony. Then, when the Canadian Army came calling in the darkest hours of the war, looking for men who could speak Cree, young Cree men, many of whom had grown up in the shadow of these schools, volunteered. They joined up for many reasons: patriotism, a warrior tradition, a desire to escape poverty, or simply to fight the fascism that threatened the world. Among them were men whose names would become legend in their communities. They'll remain secret from the world for decades. They were brought together in secret training camps. The task ahead of them was monumental. They couldn't just speak Cree over the radio. A German linguist, given enough time, might be able to identify the language family and eventually piece together patterns. They needed a code within a language. They had to invent a new vocabulary for a war their ancestors could never have imagined. The Cree language is descriptive, rooted in the natural world, in hunting, and in the landscape. It is a language of verbs, of action. The Code Talkers had to take this ancient tongue and wrap it around the machinery of destruction. It was a process of brilliant linguistic improvisation. When they needed a word for the Spitfire fighter plane, with its distinctive roar and speed, they called it Isko Tupiasi, the Thunderbird. The Mustang fighter, known for its range and power, became the Wild Horse. The mosquito bomber, fast and stinging, kept its name, translated into Cree. But what about the heavier machinery of war? A tank became a creeping buffalo. A destroyer in the Atlantic hunting submarines was a fast-moving shooting boat. And the hated U-boat, the invisible steel shark preying on the convoys, became the iron fish, or sometimes the underwater sneak. They built a lexicon of hundreds of terms. It was a code that existed nowhere in writing. It was stored only in the minds of the men who created it. It was incredibly faster than any encryption machine. 2 Cree speakers, one at headquarters and one on the front line, could communicate a complex message about troop movements or supply dumps in seconds. To anyone listening in, it was just a stream of guttural sounds, a rhythmic, flowing language that defied analysis. By late 1943 and early 1944, these men were ready for deployment. They were shipped across the Atlantic, sailing through the very black pit that their work would eventually help to close. They arrived in a Britain that was battered, weary, and serving as the massive staging ground for the invasion of Europe. The pressure was immense. The build-up to D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, involved the most complex logistical choreography in human history. Millions of tons of supplies, thousands of ships, and armies of men had to be moved in absolute secrecy. The Atlantic supply lines had to be secured, finally and completely, to feed this massive buildup. The Allied bombing campaign against German industry and U-boat pens had to be intensified. The airwaves were jammed with traffic. The standard encryption teams were overwhelmed. Messages were backlogged. Commanders were screaming for information. This was the environment the Cree Code Talkers stepped into. They were assigned to Critical Positions Division headquarters, supply depots, and units coordinating the massive air wings. Across the Channel, in the occupied territories and back in Germany, the Nazi intelligence apparatus was on high alert. They knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where or when. Dr. Albright and his team were monitoring every frequency, looking for the slip-up, the pattern, the piece of information that would betray the Allied plans. They were listening for the rigid structure of English or the mathematical patterns of a poorly enciphered machine code. Then, one night in early 1944, the headphones of a German radio intercept operator in northern France crackled with something new. It wasn't English, it wasn't French or Polish. It wasn't the rhythmic static of a machine cipher. It was a human voice, speaking rapidly, excitedly. The sounds were strange explosive consonants, long vowels, a cadence that seemed musical but completely unintelligible. The operator spun his dials, trying to clear the signal. He recorded it on a wax cylinder. He flagged it for immediate priority and sent it up the chain of command. Within hours, that recording was on Dr. Albright's desk in Berlin. He listened to it. He played it back at half speed. He felt a cold spike of irritation. It sounded like gibberish. Yet, the context, the frequency it was transmitted on, the brevity of the message, the immediate flurry of Allied movement that followed suggested it was high-level tactical communication. He brought in his linguists, the professors who had scoffed at the primitive languages of North America. Years before now, huddled around a speaker, sweating. They identified the sounds as likely indigenous North American, probably Algonquian in origin, but that was useless. Knowing the language family was like knowing a padlock is made of steel, it doesn't give you the key. They tried frequency analysis, looking for repeated words. They found them. The word for Thunderbird appeared constantly in transmissions coordinating air raids. The terms for iron fish and creeping buffalo peppered the airwaves. But without the code book, which existed only in the heads of the Cree soldiers, the words were meaningless noises. Albright grew furious. He had spent his life devoted to the idea that the Aryan intellect, aided by superior technology, was unbeatable. Now, he was being stymied by something he considered beneath contempt. He ordered his staff to work around the clock. He demanded results. He railed against the mongrel Allied armies using savage tactics. But while Albright was throwing tantrums in Berlin, the tide of the war was shifting in the cold Atlantic and the skies over Europe. The Cree Code Talkers were going to work. They were stationed in damp basements in London, in the back of trucks near the coast, and at Bomber Command airfields. They became the secure nervous system for the final squeeze on the Third Reich. The battle against the U-boats was no longer just about defending convoys. It was about hunting them down at their source. The massive Allied bombing raids that targeted the shipyards of Hamburg, Kiel, and the concrete U-boat pens on the French coast required complex coordination. Weather reports, target updates, and squadron rendezvous points had to be transmitted instantly and securely. If the Germans knew a raid was coming, they could scramble their night fighters and flak batteries, turning the sky into a slaughterhouse. If they didn't know, the Lancaster and Halifax bombers could creep in and drop their payloads on the factories building the submarines. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, a Cree Code Talker, sitting at a bomber command station, received a frantic request from a forward air controller. A massive formation of bombers was headed for a crucial U-boat component factory deep in Germany. The weather had shifted unexpectedly over the target area. The primary target was obscured. They needed to divert to the secondary target, a nearby shipyard. Normally, encoding, transmitting, decoding, and verifying this order would take 20, maybe 30 minutes. By then, the bombers would be over the wrong target or forced to turn back. The Cree soldier picked up his microphone. In seconds, he spoke a string of words that translated to, "Big birds change path. Sky blanket over first nest. Go to second nest by the big water." Miles away, another Cree soldier in the lead bomber's radio cradle heard the message. He didn't need a codebook. He instantly understood. He relayed the coordinates to the pilot in English. The entire formation banked in unison. On the ground in Germany, the air defense radar operators were confused. The bombers were turning. They weren't heading for the city they expected. By the time they recalculated and alerted the fighter squadrons, the bombs were already whistling down on the shipyards. Dr. Albright's intercept stations picked up the transmission. He stared at the transcript of the phonetic sounds. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that an order had just been given and executed right under his nose. He knew that somewhere in Germany, something vital to the war effort was burning because he couldn't understand a language his own government had deemed obsolete. The primitive tongue birthed in the forests and plains of Canada was now directing the most advanced industrial warfare in history, and the Nazi war machine, blind and deaf to this new frequency, was beginning to stagger. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the day the world held its breath. As the gray dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, the largest armada in history churned toward the French coast. It was a storm of steel and fire, but amidst the thunder of the naval bombardment and the scream of the landing craft engines, there was another sound, quieter but infinitely more dangerous to the German defenders. It was the sound of the Cree language cutting through the static of the tactical radio networks. The Allied commanders knew that the first few hours of the invasion would be chaos. They knew that German jamming units would be flooding the airwaves with noise. They knew that sophisticated German listening posts would be intercepting every frantic call for reinforcements, every coordinate for an artillery strike. The security of the invasion force hung by a thread. If the Germans could decipher the Allied communications, they could shift their panzer divisions to the exact points of the beachhead where the lines were breaking. But they couldn't decipher the Cree. On the decks of the command ships and huddled in the sand dunes of Juneau and Omaha beaches, the Code Talkers went to work. They were the lifeline. When a company of infantry was pinned down by machine gun fire from a concrete bunker, the radio operator would hand the microphone to the Cree soldier. He would look at the map, he would see the bunker, and he would speak the words that would bring down the wrath of the heavens. "Send the heavy rain to the stone nest at the little river mouth," he might say in his native tongue, his voice calm amidst the explosions. Miles offshore, on a destroyer rocking in the swell, another Cree speaker would hear the message. He translated it instantly. "Artillery strike requested. Coordinates confirmed. Bunker at the estuary." The guns would turn. The shells would fly. And the bunker would vanish in a cloud of dust and concrete. Back in his bunker in Berlin, Dr. Albright was watching the reports flood in from the Normandy front. It was a disaster. The Atlantic Wall, the impenetrable fortress of the Reich, was crumbling. But what terrified Albright more than the loss of territory was the total collapse of his intelligence network. His operators were reporting complete confusion. They could hear the Allied commanders talking, they could hear the voices, but they couldn't understand a single word. "It is the ghost language again," a subordinate reported, his voice trembling. "It is everywhere, on the beaches, in the air, even the ships." Albright slammed his fist onto his desk, scattering his charts. He had spent years building the Enigma network, a masterpiece of mathematical complexity, and it was being dismantled by a language that had been spoken in birch bark canoes and buffalo hide teepees long before the internal combustion engine was invented. The racial superiority he had preached, the technological arrogance he had clung to, it was all dissolving. The primitives were not just matching the master race, they were outsmarting. As the Allies broke out of Normandy and began the long, hard drive toward the German border, the role of the Code Talkers evolved. They became essential to the hunter-killer groups that were finally winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats, forced out of their French ports by the advancing armies, were desperate. They were massing in the shipping lanes, trying to cut off the supplies that were feeding the liberation of Europe. The Royal Canadian Navy and the U.S. Navy were hunting them down with ruthless efficiency. But hunting a submarine requires speed. When a reconnaissance plane spots a periscope, it has seconds to relay the position to a destroyer before the sub dives and vanishes. If that message is sent in standard code, it has to be encrypted, transmitted, received, and decrypted. That takes minutes. In minutes, a U-boat can travel a mile underwater. It can hide in a thermal layer. It can escape. But if the pilot speaks Cree? There is a documented instance from late 1944 that illustrates the lethal efficiency of this system. A Canadian patrol plane, flying low over the gray Atlantic swells, spotted the wake of a U-boat snorkel the breathing tube that allowed the sub to run its diesel engines underwater. The pilot, a man from Saskatchewan, keyed his mic. He didn't use a code book. He spoke to the Code Talker aboard the nearby frigate. Iron fish breathing hard, north wind. 2 fingers left of the sun. The message was instantaneous. The Code Talker on the frigate screamed the bearing to the bridge. The captain turned the ship hard to port. The depth charge crews ran to their stations. The German U-boat commander never knew he had been spotted. He was listening to the radio traffic, expecting to hear the telltale mechanical rhythm of an encoded contact report. He heard only a strange, guttural voice. He dismissed it as interference. 3 minutes later, the depth charges rained down around him. The hull cracked. The pressure hull imploded. The iron fish died in the darkness, sent to the bottom by a voice it couldn't understand. This scene played out dozens of times across the ocean. The black pit closed. The supply lines held. The millions of tons of steel and food required to crush the Third Reich flowed unimpeded into Europe. The U-boat fleet, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was being blinded and bludgeoned into submission. By the spring of 1945, the Code Talkers were crossing the Rhine River into Germany itself. They were walking through the ruins of the cities that had once sneered at their existence. They saw the devastation of the master race. They saw the shattered swastikas and the broken eagles. Dr. Albright, in the final days of the war, found himself in a basement in Hamburg, surrounded by the shredding of documents. The Red Army was approaching from the east, the Americans and Canadians from the west. His life's work was ashes. He had spent the war trying to crack the primitive code. He had failed. He realized, with a bitter clarity, that the Nazi regime had been defeated not just by superior numbers, but by its own blindness. They had underestimated the diversity of humanity. They had believed that strength looked a certain way, spoke a certain way. They had ignored the power of the ancient world, and the ancient world had come back to haunt them. When the Canadian troops liberated the area, they found the German intelligence centers abandoned. But amidst the chaos, they found recordings, wax cylinders and magnetic tapes filled with hours of Cree speech. The Germans had been recording it until the very end, obsessively trying to find the key, never realizing that the key was a culture they had thought was extinct. The war ended in May 1945. The guns fell silent. The Code Talkers, men like Charles Checker Tompkins, put down their radios. They had done their job. They had transmitted thousands of messages. They had saved countless lives. They had helped to break the U-boat fleet and open the door to Europe. But their mission wasn't over. As they prepared to ship home, they were pulled aside by intelligence officers. They were sworn to an oath of absolute secrecy. "You cannot tell anyone what you did," the officers told them. "Not your wives, not your mothers, not your chiefs. This code is still classified. We might need it again." And so, the heroes of the secret war returned to Canada, not with parades, but with silence. They took off their uniforms and returned to the reserves, to the very communities that the government was still trying to dismantle. The tragedy of the Cree Code Talkers, and indeed, all Indigenous veterans of that war is what happened next. They had fought for freedom. They had fought against tyranny. They had proven that their language was a weapon of incredible power. Yet, when they stepped off the trains in their home provinces, they stepped back into the Indian Act. They were stripped of their status in some cases. They were denied the veterans' benefits that white soldiers received. They couldn't vote. They couldn't enter a Legion Hall to have a beer with the men they had served with. And most painfully, they returned to a country that was still taking their children away to residential schools, punishing them for speaking the very language that had just helped save the world. For decades, the Code Talkers kept their oath. They watched as movies were made about the war, movies that showed white heroes and technical wizards winning the day. They saw the Enigma machine celebrated. They saw the Navajo Code Talkers of the Pacific Theater slowly gain recognition in the United States. But the Canadian story remained buried in the classified files of the Department of National Defense. Men like Tompkins lived their lives carrying a secret that was both a burden and a source of immense private pride. They worked on farms, in lumber camps, and on the trap lines. They raised families. They spoke Cree to their children in whispers, knowing that this forbidden tongue was actually the language of victors. It wasn't until the code was finally declassified decades later that the truth began to emerge. The elderly men, now grandfathers and great-grandfathers, were finally allowed to speak. When the story broke, it stunned the nation. Canadians learned that the primitive languages of the prairies had been the ultimate encryption. They learned that the Wehrmacht, the most technologically advanced army of the time, had been baffled by the words for Thunderbird and Iron Fish. Dr. Albright, the fictional composite of the very real Nazi intelligence officers who hunted these codes, represents the ultimate failure of fascism. He represents the arrogance of believing that there is only one right way to be human. The Code Talkers proved him wrong. They proved that diversity is not a weakness, it is the ultimate strategic advantage. In the end, the U-boats are rusting at the bottom of the Atlantic. The bunkers of the Third Reich are overgrown with ivy. But the Cree language, it is still here. It survived the residential schools. It survived the government bans. And it survived the concentrated effort of the Nazi war machine to silence it. Today, if you visit the graves of these men, or the monuments that are finally being built to honor them, you might hear the wind whistling through the grass of the prairies. It sounds like a whisper, but if you listen closely, you can hear the echoes of the Thunderbird and the wild horse. You can hear the language that defeated an empire. The Nazis thought they were fighting a war of machines. They didn't realize they were fighting a war of spirits. And in that war, the primitive code wasn't just a way to talk, it was a way to win.